The sound begins not with a roar, but with a rhythmic wet slap, the sound of a leather flap miles long, soaked in a mixture of tallow and cod oil, sealing itself against a cast iron lip. Then the hiss, a sharp, cavernous intake of breath that seems to pull the very air out of the Devon countryside. We are standing on the edge of the Exe estuary in 1847, and for a moment the world is silent. There is no smoke, there is no clatter of pistons, there is only a 4-car mahogany carriage gliding ghost-like at 60 miles per hour, propelled by nothing but the weight of the atmosphere itself. Today, if you stand at the Star Cross railway station, you will see a strange red sandstone tower. It is an ornate Italianate structure, looking more like a Venetian campanile than an industrial relic. It stands amidst the modern salt spray and the hum of electric pendolinos, stripped of its machinery, its windows staring blankly at the sea. To the thousands of commuters who pass it daily, it is a mystery, a folly of a bygone era. But this was once the beating heart of the lost lung of England. This was the South Devon Atmospheric Railway, the most expensive, most ambitious, and most spectacular failure in the history of British engineering. It was a vision of a future that never arrived, a world of silent, smokeless travel that predated the Hyperloop by nearly 2 centuries, now reduced to a few crumbling towers and a handful of forgotten blueprints in the National Archives. The paradox of the atmospheric railway lies in its brilliance. It was designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel, a man whose name is synonymous with the iron will of the Victorian age. Yet, while his bridges stand and his tunnels remain in use, this, his most poetic endeavor, was wiped from the map in less than a year. It was a system that worked perfectly in theory and failed catastrophically in the face of nature. It promised to conquer the Dainton Incline, a slope so steep that the heavy steam locomotives of the day groaned and died on its ascent, by removing the engine from the train entirely. The engine would stay stationary, housed in these beautiful towers, pumping air out of a pipe to create a vacuum that would suck the train forward like a pellet in a blowgun. Chapter 1. The Gospel of the Vacuum. The year is 1844. England is in the grip of railway mania, a speculative fever where fortunes are made and lost on the stroke of a surveyor's pen. At the center of it all is the Great Western Railway and its chief engineer, the 5-foot-tall giant Brunel. He is a man obsessed with speed, aesthetics and the broad gauge, a 7-foot wide track that made other railways look like toys. But Devon presented a problem. The terrain was too brutal for the 060 steam engines of the era. To flatten the hills would cost millions. To climb them required a miracle. Enter Joseph and Jacob Samuda and the inventor Samuel Clegg. They proposed a system that seemed like sorcery, the atmospheric traction. By laying a 15-inch cast iron pipe between the rails and using a stationary steam engine every 3 miles to evacuate the air, they could create a pressure differential. A piston connected to the train through a continuous slit at the top of the pipe would be pushed forward by the weight of the atmosphere behind it. No heavy engine meant the trains could be lighter, faster and, crucially, silent. The aesthetic of this project was unlike anything the industrial world had seen. Brunel didn't just build factories, he built cathedrals of power. The pumping stations at Starcross, Dawlish and Totnes were designed in the Italianate style, featuring elaborate stonework and high, elegant chimneys that disguised their purpose. Inside, massive steam engines with 20-foot flywheels costing upwards of £5,000 each, a king's ransom in 1845, labored to create the void. The cost of the iron piping alone was staggering, quoted at approximately £4,000 per mile. But there was a hidden enemy in this pristine vision. To keep the vacuum, the longitudinal slit in the pipe had to be sealed. The solution was a leather valve, miles and miles of high-quality oxhide, reinforced with iron plates and greased with a secret compound of beeswax and tallow. This grease was the lifeblood of the system. In the damp, salty air of the Devon coast, the smell was unmistakable, a heavy, cloying scent of rendered animal fat and brine. It was here, in the microscopic gaps of the leather, that the Industrial Revolution met the limits of organic chemistry. The public saw a miracle, the engineers saw a desperate, greasy struggle to hold back the air. Chapter 2. The Anatomy of a Vacuum. To understand the audacity of the South Devon Atmospheric Railway, one must look past the mahogany paneling of the carriages and into the dark iron throat of the tube itself. This wasn't just a train, it was a 3-mile-long pneumatic circuit. Between the rails lay a continuous line of cast iron pipes, 15 inches in internal diameter, bolted together with lead-packed joints to prevent leakage. Every section had to be perfectly bored, a task assigned to the heavy hitters of Victorian industry, the firms of Harveys of Hale and Samuda Brothers. At the head of the train sat the piston carriage, a specialized vehicle housing a 15-foot-long iron rod that dipped through a slit in the pipe. At the end of this rod was the piston itself, a disc of iron fringed with leather, designed to fit the pipe with the precision of a syringe. But the true genius and the ultimate curse was the longitudinal valve. Imagine a 3-mile-long zipper made of oxhide. This leather flap was hinged on one side and weighted with iron plates on the other. As the piston moved forward, a series of rollers on the carriage lifted the leather flap just enough to allow the connecting arm to pass through. Immediately behind the piston, a closing roller pressed the leather back down into a groove filled with a sealant known as the composition. This mixture was a proprietary blend of tallow, beeswax and lime, designed to create an airtight bond the moment it was pressed into place. In the pumping houses, like the one still standing at Starcross, monumental steam engines labored to create the void. These were not the mobile, chuffing beasts of the main lines, but massive, stationary beam engines built by Maudsley's Sons and Field. At the Starcross station alone, two 80-horsepower engines worked in tandem, driving massive air pumps with a 72-inch stroke. The cost of these stationary plants was astronomical. While a standard steam locomotive of the time, such as a Stephenson long boiler, might cost £1,500 to £2,000, the infrastructure for a single 3-mile stretch of the atmospheric system exceeded £10,000 in machinery alone. Brunel's budget for the line from Exeter to Newton Abbot spiraled toward £433,000, a figure that made the directors of the South Devon Railway tremble. Chapter 3. The Ghost at 68 miles per hour. The mechanics produced a sensation that was quite literally ahead of its time. On a crisp morning in 1847, a test train consisting of the piston carriage and 3 passenger coaches achieved a speed of 68 miles per hour, a pace that was unthinkable to a public still accustomed to the 10-mile-per-hour jog of a stagecoach. Because there was no engine on the train, there was no vibration, no soot, and no deafening roar of a boiler. Passengers describe it as flying on the wings of the wind. The tractive force was immense. Where traditional locomotives would spin their wheels on the 1 in 40 gradient of the Dainton Bank, the atmospheric piston pulled with a steady, relentless vacuum pressure of 12 to 15 pounds per square inch. It was as if a giant, invisible hand was reeling the train in on a cable of air. However, the struggle for efficiency was fought in the inches of mercury on the vacuum gauges. Brunel demanded a vacuum of 18 to 20 inches to maintain schedule, but the physics of the era were working against him. The engines had to start pumping long before the train arrived, consuming vast quantities of coal, sometimes 4 times as much as a conventional locomotive, just to maintain the ready state of the pipe. If a train was delayed, the engines kept pumping, burning through the company's capital with every stroke of the beam. Then there was the human mechanical element, the brakeman. Because the train was propelled by a vacuum that couldn't be throttled from the cab, stopping at a station required a terrifying dance of manual brakes and precisely timed valve releases. If the brakeman missed his mark, the vacuum would continue to pull, dragging the train past the platform. At the Forest Hill tests in London, a similar system had actually sucked a carriage right off the end of the line. The technical battle was also one of chemistry. In the sweltering Devon summer of 1847, the composition began to fail. The beeswax melted and the tallow turned to liquid, running out of the grooves and leaving the pipe gasping for air. But the true mechanical nightmare arrived with the winter. The leather, once supple with oil, froze into a rigid, brittle state. The iron plates attached to the leather began to oxidize, the rust eating into the hide. And then came the rats. Drawn by the scent of the tallow and cod oil, the local rodent population began to treat the 3-mile valve as a buffet. They chewed through the leather seals, creating thousands of tiny leaks that no engine in the world could overcome. Brunel, the man who had mastered iron and stone, found his empire being unraveled by the common brown rat and the unpredictable British frost. Chapter 4. The Golden Hour of the Silent Way. By the spring of 1848, for a brief, flickering moment, it seemed that Isambard Kingdom Brunel had actually done it. The South Devon Atmospheric Railway was no longer an experimental curiosity, it was a functioning artery of British life. This was the era of the pleasure trip. Tourists from London would take the Great Western Railway to Exeter and then transfer to the atmospheric line for the coastal run to Dawlish and Teignmouth. The experience was transformative. In an age where steam travel meant enduring a constant barrage of hot cinders, sulfurous smoke and the deafening clatter of a high-pressure boiler, the atmospheric line offered a surreal tranquility. The literary titan Charles Dickens, a man obsessed with the pulse of Victorian progress, watched these developments with a mixture of awe and skepticism. To the Victorian traveller, leaning out of a window and seeing the lush Devon cliffs without a speck of soot hitting their eyes felt like stepping into the 20th century. The speed was intoxicating. On the regular runs, trains were easily maintaining 40 miles per hour, but in private trials they were pushing closer to 70. There is a recorded instance of a light train covering the 8.25 miles from Exeter to Starcross in just under 9 minutes. This wasn't just fast, it was theoretically faster than any scheduled service in the world. The social elite flocked to the line, it became a symbol of British exceptionalism. The Italianate pumping stations, with their soaring towers and meticulously landscaped grounds, became landmarks of industrial beauty. Brunel's vision was total. He wasn't just building a transport link, he was curating an experience. He even utilized the newly invented electric telegraph to coordinate the pumping houses. Before a train departed Exeter, a signal was pulsed down the wire to the Starcross and Dawlish engines: "Start pumping." It was one of the first truly integrated high-tech networks in history, a precursor to the synchronized automation of modern transit systems. Chapter 5. The Economic Hemorrhage. But beneath the polish of the mahogany carriages, the balance sheets were bleeding. The dream was being crushed by the brutal reality of operating ratio. While a traditional locomotive only consumed fuel when it was moving, Brunel's stationary engines had to maintain a vacuum across miles of pipe regardless of whether a train was in the section or not. The leakage wasn't just air, it was money. In late 1847, the reports from the South Devon Railway's accountants began to look like a post-mortem. The cost of coal for the stationary engines was staggering, nearly 3 shillings per train mile compared to less than 1 shilling for a standard steam locomotive on the Great Western Main Line. The composition sealant, that temperamental mix of fat and wax, was costing the company £1,600 per year just in maintenance, and yet it still failed. The board of directors, initially seduced by Brunel's charisma, began to fracture. They were staring at a total capital expenditure of over £430,000 for a system that was only working on a 20-mile stretch from Exeter to Newton Abbot. The planned extension to Plymouth would require even more massive pumping houses and more expensive piping. At a heated board meeting in August 1848, the technical reports were damning. The leather valve, which was supposed to last years, was disintegrating. It wasn't just the rats or the frost, it was the sheer mechanical fatigue of being lifted and pressed 60 times a day by the passing piston. The leather was delaminating, stripping away in great oily ribbons. Chapter 6. The Modern Echo, from 1848 to the Hyperloop. The tragedy of the atmospheric railway is not that it failed, but that it was almost right. We see the same pattern today in the struggle for maglev trains and the much-hyped Hyperloop. Brunel was chasing the same dragon, the elimination of friction and the separation of the power source from the vehicle. He understood that carrying a massive heavy engine and a ton of water and coal was an inherently inefficient way to move people. Like the Silicon Valley disruptors of the 21st century, Brunel suffered from the innovator's hubris. He believed that engineering will could overcome the fundamental limitations of materials. He gambled an entire railway on a technology that hadn't been stress-tested for the realities of the British climate. The parallel is striking. Just as modern tech ventures often fail because they lack backward compatibility or ignore the last mile problem, Brunel's system was incompatible with the rest of the British rail network. To move an atmospheric carriage onto a standard steam line required a complex and dangerous shunting process that negated all the time saved during the high-speed run. In September 1848, the decision was finalized. The board issued a stark ultimatum. The atmospheric system would be abandoned. The engines were to be sold for scrap, and the pipes, those miles of meticulously bored cast iron, were to be ripped from the ground. In a single weekend, the lost lung of England was cut out. The silent ghost-like glides were replaced by the familiar heavy chuffing of the very steam engines Brunel had tried to banish. The future had been cancelled due to a lack of tallow and the persistence of mice. Chapter 7. The Great Regression. The end did not come with a bang, but with a hollow metallic clang of iron pipes being stacked like cordwood on the sidings of Newton Abbot. On September 9, 1848, the atmospheric experiment was officially terminated. Within weeks, the silent, elegant carriages were coupled to standard 060 steam locomotives, beasts of fire and water that Brunel had hoped to render obsolete. The transition was jarring. The very tracks that had felt like the frontier of a new civilization were suddenly covered in the thick, oily soot of the past. The financial post-mortem was a scene of industrial carnage. The South Devon Railway Company had poured roughly £434,000 into the atmospheric system, over £50 million in today's currency. When the equipment was auctioned off, the return was pathetic. Those magnificent Maudslay engines, masterpieces of Victorian precision that had cost nearly £5,000 apiece, were sold for scrap value, some fetching as little as £1,000 to be broken down for their raw iron. The miles of 15-inch piping, the literal lungs of the line, were ripped from the earth. Some were melted down, others found a second, humbler life as drainage culverts and sewage pipes beneath the streets of Exeter and Plymouth. To this day, it is whispered that parts of the city's hidden water network are composed of the very tubes that once carried the fastest passengers in the world. For Brunel, the failure was a rare stain on a legendary career, yet his reaction was characteristically stoic. In his report to the directors, he took full responsibility, admitting that the leakage of the valve was an insurmountable defect of the materials available to the age. He didn't blame the rats or the weather. He acknowledged that he had asked too much of the leather and the fat. He retreated into the construction of the Royal Albert Bridge at Saltash, turning his back on the vacuum to focus once more on the permanence of stone and the brute strength of iron girders. Chapter 8. The Silent Sentinels of the Coast. If you travel the sea-wall stretch of the railway today, between the red cliffs of Dawlish and the estuary at Starcross, the ghosts are still visible if you know where to look. The most prominent survivor is the Starcross pumping station. It stands as a defiant red sandstone monument to a lost future. For decades after the atmospheric collapse, it served as a humble coal store, its elegant Venetian windows boarded up, its soaring chimney, once designed to carry away only the cleanest steam, standing cold and smokeless. Today it houses a small museum and a fishing club, its interior stripped of the gargantuan beam engines, leaving only the vast echoing spaces where the vacuum was once forged. At Totnes, the pumping house was partially incorporated into a local dairy. At Torquay, the station was demolished to make way for the expansion of the very steam-based infrastructure it sought to replace. But the most poignant relics are the ones buried beneath your feet. Occasionally, during track maintenance or coastal erosion, a fragment of the cast iron pipe is unearthed, caked in a century of Devon mud, still bearing the marks of the Samuda brothers' foundry. The name atmospheric survives in the local topography, in the names of pubs like the Atmospheric Railway Inn in Starcross, where commuters drink pints of ale mere yards from where the great leather valve once hissed. It is a strange, quintessentially British irony, a failed multi-million-pound technological revolution reduced to a cozy pub sign and a decorative tower. Chapter 9. The Mirror of Progress. The story of the South Devon Atmospheric Railway is more than a footnote in a dusty engineering manual. It is a mirror held up to the face of human ambition. We live in a world that prizes the disruptor, the visionary who claims they can rewrite the laws of physics and commerce. Brunel was the original disruptor. He understood nearly 200 years ago that the future of transport lay in the removal of the engine from the vehicle, a concept we are only now revisiting with maglev technology and high-speed pneumatic transit. But the vacuum reminds us that progress is not a ladder, it is a graveyard. For every Stephenson's rocket that changes the world, there are a dozen atmospheric railways, ideas that were technically brilliant but materially premature. The world treats its creators with a brutal short-term memory. We remember the bridges that stand, but we pave over the dreams that leaked. We celebrate the winners of the Industrial Revolution, yet we forget that the very world we inhabit was built on the scorched earth of failed experiments. The Starcross Tower doesn't just represent a bad investment, it represents the audacity to imagine a world without smoke. It stands as a reminder that the correct way of doing things, the coal, the oil, the internal combustion, was not the only way imagined. We are surrounded by these lost paths, these dead ends of history that were, for a few months in 1848, the pinnacle of human achievement. As the modern cross-country Voyager screams past the red sandstone of Starcross at 100 miles per hour, its diesel engines roaring and its exhaust hazing the air, the tower remains silent. It is a silence earned through a century of neglect, a silence that once promised a cleaner, faster, and more poetic way to move through the world. The vacuum is still there, in the empty rooms and the forgotten pipes, a void where a different version of the 20th century was supposed to begin. Nothing remains of the dream but the architecture of its ambition and the quiet rust of its discarded heart.